My name is David Livingstone, basically independent researcher. I've written several books, mostly dealing with the history of the occult. My latest is called Ordo ab Chao, which is very much a culmination of all my years of research combined, because I've been at it for about 30 years now. And the interesting thing is that most of what I studied until recently just provided me a foundation to build on and to help me, further understand what I discovered more recently. So, I'm quite astounded by how much I've been still able to discover after all this time. And that's pretty much what's been put into Ordo ab Chao.
You've got a whole section in Ordo ab Chao really about the it's kind of the black arts, haven't you? Which is looking at the actual organisational structure of some of this stuff today. So it's all very well following this stuff historically, but I'm a bit concerned that although there seems to be a certain acceptance of studying this stuff as history, people are a little bit more uncomfortable when it talks about things to do with these satanic elites, these cults. I mean, they may not be elites. They may also, of course, be completely what you might call ordinary people. But can you just say something about how that's organised today?
Yeah. The challenge is that all this stuff is kept secret, right? Intentionally. So it can be pretty difficult to piece together. And as you said, there's very little scholarship on it. Fortunately, though, over the last, I think, maybe 20 or 30 years, there's been a great increase in academic study of occultism. I think that started with, largely with Frances Yates and her first academic study of the Rosicrucian movement. And it showed that it's possible to bring sort of sober, intelligent scholarship to subjects that were typically fringe until recently. So, these subjects of the occult were very much taboo until that time. So I think that's created an influence where we've seen a lot of academic study of occultism and particularly its long history of it, but a slight increase in some of the study of it recently.
I would also add, I don't know how much if you've looked at this stuff much yourself, but I was fascinating reading Margaret Murray's The Witch Cult in Western Europe and The God of the Witches, which is just almost taking this, the stuff which is, for establishment really shies away from, as this is very matter of fact. And, this is what for example, she says in her books that, well, there's all this talk about the devil, but the devil is actually just the individual who's the head of these particular covens. Yeah. And, you don't need to go, look for some sort of God that these people are worshipping. No, they see the devil as the leader of the coven, and there's some very basic stuff in there which it just seems that many of the writers of this on this topic don't get.
Well, Margaret Murray is an interesting case because she's considered pretty fringe, right? She's certainly not considered. She's considered an example of non-academic study which goes too far. I think her.
Well, yeah, she was an anthropologist professionally.
Yeah, but her work is not well recognized in academia. So because she arrives at conclusions that are controversial, not well accepted, and the main myth that has been built up in our time is that witchcraft, the whole witch craze was an invention of the Catholic Church against innocent women who were basically just, nature worshippers or midwives and things of that sort. So, this is a propaganda, an agenda of propaganda that's been very successful. The whole idea of witchcraft and witches has largely been discredited. Here in North America, every year, there's people celebrate Halloween, and the entire mythos around witchcraft So goblins, witches, pumpkins, the whole apparatus of that mythology is considered just playful folklore with no validity. Basically, is it's not considered to have any truth whatsoever. So this is amazing because of to what extent there was basically all of the evidence, all of the testimonies in support of the crimes of the witches of the Middle Ages are treated as inventions by people who had, access to grind, usually Christians of some authority within the church. So that's ridiculous. But so it was one thing that Margaret Murray did is she dared to try to give some justification to the survival of some kind of pagan practice among the witches, and she traced it more specifically to the cult of Diana. So I think that's partly true, but the reality is Diana, as a goddess and as a survival of the ancient goddess, is basically just the female aspect of the same infernal dying god that was always worshipped and has been worshipped for a very long time. So to say, I don't think it would be accurate to say the witches worship or treated the devil as their leader, because in reality, there were devil worshippers existing for a very long time. They were typically Gnostic cults. These were cults basically who chose to interpret the message of the Bible in reverse. So they were cognizant of the story of the Bible and God's war against the devil, and they choose to side with the devil, who they revered as a kind of liberator who liberated us from the tyranny of God's supposedly oppressive rules. So that's the reality, I think, of the history of witchcraft, and witchcraft was really, it was to some extent fringe, because it was the nocturnal practices of people who, I guess, maybe in some ways were on the fringe of the core of the occult development. Because if you want to look at the core history of the real leaders of the movement, they tended to be philosophers and scientists and people of usually some renown and some political influence. And so for those groups, you got to look at groups, especially starting with the Rosicrucians. But even the Rosicrucians and Freemasons that came after them, they always had some degree of affiliation with the cult of witchcraft, at least through shared ideas, some sympathy for each other's belief systems, and things of that nature.
Yeah, well, she definitely focuses on witchcraft, but she's done something quite similar to you. As she believes that there's really a great similarity with these organisations today, which are basically, they're swearing oaths of secrecy. They are literally relinquishing voluntarily their own life if they break those. And she's tracing it right back into the past. She thinks that actually, look, this is something that's not new. And the idea that it's all something that's in the past is, if a historian is doing their job honestly, they should be able to trace it back quite easily. And really, I think you've kind of built on the sort of work that people that she's done and said, well, actually, this one cult is just one of many cults, several cults. It may not be the main one, but it's I think it's quite important work that she did in blowing that apart in what, if you ever read her stuff, you'll see it's done in a very matter-of-fact fashion, and she's not loading the language. She's pointing out things like, well, actually many of these witches are men. It's not just a female thing, which it's the way that, as you were describing, it's kind of come down in mythology. But anyway, look, trying to bring things up a bit closer to today. In your book, Ordo Abkeo, you have a whole section called The Black Order. Can you? And on the front of it is a picture of this guy Alexander Dugin. Now he's been in the news this week over in it's on the RT website, which you have to sort of maneuver around these various Chinese walls to get to watch. But anyway, when you do that, you'll find he's saying that the West created a Nazi paradise in Ukraine to fight the Russians. Well, I mean, that's an interesting thing because there quite clearly is this Nazi movement in Ukraine. They've been having their festivals and things like that with all the fire, rather like the old Nazis of the 1930s. And the Russians have actually launched this, what they call special military operation, the invasion of Ukraine, in order to apparently denazify the place. So, this is something that Dugin has been publicly saying, but he says he doesn't think that that these Ukrainians will win, and actually ultimately the Russians will win. So what is Dugin's role? It also, we must also mention the fact that his daughter was blown up in a bomb attack a few months ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Dugin is a pretty curious character. So of course, probably well known. He's often referred to as Putin's Rasputin. The way that I describe him is that when you look at the history of modern occultism, there's certain personalities that stand out, right? So most recently, you could probably begin with Edward Bulwer Lytton. And he was supposedly, the head of the Rosicrucian, English Rosicrucian movement, really the godfather of the occult revival of the late 18th century. And that's a movement that gave birth to people like Blavatsky, the Golden Dawn, Aleister Crowley, the OTO, and that whole network. So when you look at the pantheon of people who have been, highly influential, I think it's pretty easy to identify them. So Edward Bulwer Lytton, Elena Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, Pappas, Julie Savola, and in our time, Alexander Dugin. So it's really important to understand Dugin in the context, the larger context. You can't explain Dugin without explaining the entire gamut of the occult underground in the last century and a half. So basically, the tradition that he comes from is the tradition called synarchism, which begins with Saint-Yves d'Alvedre. There's so many tangents to go on. It's difficult. It's hard to know where how to keep it simple. But basically, it was a movement. So he was. Where can I start? It's a movement that had an important influence in Russia at the turn of the century, closely affiliated with Tsar Nicholas II, because they saw Tsar Nicholas II as being what they call the White Tsar of Shambhala, who had been prophesied to kind of rescue the peoples of the Orient. And so this is how you get this early network that connected these early Russian occultists, because active at the time, consulting Pappas was, Tsar Nicholas II was Pappas. A French occultist, his real name was Charles Gosling. He was basically sort of a successor to Saint-Yves d'Alvedre, most important leader of the Martinists, and effectively, the leader of the synarchist movement. So you get this connection between the occult, burgeoning occult movement in Russia and their links with Tibet. And so this is where now you've sort of, this idea of connecting Tibet with the occult, of course, dates back a couple of centuries. It's a concept known as the Oriental Kabbalah. It's a history associated with Freemasonry that I won't get into because it's, again, another tangent. But basically, it's an idea was popularized starting mostly with Eleanor Blavatsky. So she suggested that basically Tibetan Buddhism was a survival of the ancient wisdom of the Aryan people. And that's effectively how Buddhism has, ultimately gained its popularity in the West, largely exercised through a guy like Gerald York, who was, I think, Aleister Crowley's secretary, and as well working closely with the Dalai Lama, and largely helped popularize Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in the West. We have to understand that Buddhism is a multifaceted religion like most other religions, and Tibetan Buddhism is a particular branch with a strong influence of Tantra, particularly sexual Tantra, If you look into it, there's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism called Kalachak or Tantra, which involves various sex work practices that are carried out with a sort of a female associate. These are all practices, if you can read about them, that are condoned by the current Dalai Lama himself. Anyway, so that's basically to explain where this association with Tibet came from. And so this is where you get this legend of Agartha. Gartha and Shambhala are kind of interchangeable. It's basically this realm that exists somewhere in Eastern Asia, which is governed by these superior entities that have been sort of guiding humanity's progress for years. So synarchism is apparently the political system that is adopted or promoted by these hidden entities from Agartha. So from that time forward, these synarchists are advancing this plot effectively to organize the world in a world empire governed by synarchist political ideology, which is basically the rule of people, leaders of secret societies who are in contact with, what are called the unknown superiors, or the fallen angels. So it's out of that tradition. In Russia, you've got this movement of occultists, all coming from this tradition, who continue to be associated with the Buddhist movement and Buddhist personalities, and this is how they become aligned during World War II. Because, as is well known, the Nazis sent various expeditions to Tibet, but at the same time, Vice President Henry Wallace, Vice President of the United States, sent Nicholas Roerich on simultaneous expeditions. Nicholas Roerich was a well-known Russian occultist, and he was affiliated with this entire group of Russian occultists from this tradition that I was telling you about. And then by extension, this is all linked to a brotherhood called the Brotherhood Polaire. And this is a very important group, whatever you want to call them, that are substantially influential, that I have seen rarely treated in any studies of the occult. But this is a group who believed they had made contact with an oracle from Agartha, and they were contacting the nine. Sorry, I'm losing this. That's correct. An oracle from Agartha, and so one of the people associated with this Brotherhood of Polaire was, first of all, Julius Evola, Maria Niglowska, Arturo, I can't remember his name, Ruggiero, also Mercury Iliad, who is has a very important role in popularizing the history of shamanism, and most importantly, Otto Rahn. Otto Rahn is a very curious character. He largely inspired the Indiana Jones character. He was a researcher, a Luciferian Satanist that was sent by the SS, the Ahnenerbe more specifically, to investigate and conduct researchers on the heritage of the Aryan race. So one of the things he is most famous for is his hunt for the Holy Grail. And this is how he and the Brotherhood Polaire were closely associated with the hunt for the Grail, particularly in southern France, because they associated with the castle of Montségur, which they thought was the Mund Sauvage of Wolfram von Eschenbach's poem on the Grail, which connected them to the Cathars. So they thought that the legends of the Holy Grail were basically a product of Cathar influence in France, and that had survived through the ages. So the Brotherhood Polaire, now, this is where we can understand where Dugin comes from. So Dugin is very well connected with the entire circle of the most influential occultists of the last half century. That starts with his main mentor was a guy named Jean Parvulesco. And Parvulesco himself, his mentor was Raymond Abellio. And Raymond Abellio, that's not his real name, that's his pen name that he chose because he named it after Abellio, which is the god supposedly identified by Otto Rahn as being the god worshipped by the peoples of southern France through the influence of the Cathars. And Raymond was basically a Cathar who was largely connected, identified with Percival by various authors of the Grail mysteries. So Raymond de Bellieu, now this is interesting, he was friends with Antoine Pinet. And Antoine Pinet was the founder with Jean Violet of what's called the Pinet Cercle. I think it was the year 1953. Basically, within 1 year of each other, Antoine Pinet was a founder of the Cercle as well as a founder of the Bilderberg movement. And now you got to understand, so that Antoine Pinet and Jean Violet, these are all guys who came from the synarchist movement of France, which was alive or thriving, particularly thrived under the Vichy regime during World War II. And this
you're using this word synarchist, but I mean, when I hear that and what you're describing, it sounds like a kind of international fascist group.
Yes, very much so. So from all these, so you have sort of all this secret societies that evolved from the synarchist movement, the various Martinist orders, and then you have like the Brotherhood Polaire, and they're very closely associated with AMARC, the American Rosicrucian movement. But those are the secret societies. But politically in France, they basically create a bit of a scare because they achieve so much influence that I was reading up on it today again, because it's largely now dismissed by most historians who treat it as a kind of legend, a fabricate, another conspiracy theory, basically. But it's very easy to prove. One of the main guys who was sort of the leading influence behind the movement was a guy named Jean Coutreau, and he worked closely with Aldous Huxley. And they founded a group called the Center for the Study of Human Problems. And to that group society also belonged Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is the influence behind the rise of the modern computer, sort of like a guru in Silicon Valley. So, and it's Jean Coutreau who coined the term transhumanism. So that's very much how you get that's in a separate tangent, but just to show you how they sort of connect back.
Yeah, the Pinet Cercle is very interesting. We have had two of that. We've had Nadim Zahawi and Kwasi Kwarteng, two chancellors. The most recent one here in the UK, who was forced to resign because he had been actually avoiding tax and being prosecuted by the Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs whilst he was Chancellor. Both of them were from the Pinet Cercle, and Kwarteng chaired it.
Yeah. No, but the Pinet Cercle is the way what I regard them as the umbrella organization of the Fascist International. So pretty much any major fascist organization in the last half century has been one way or the other connected to them. One branch of them is the Western Goals Institute, I think is the British version, which is the British version of the Western Goals Foundation in the United States. And that one, its president for a time was Roy Cohn, who again is really at the center of much of the right-wing conspiracy in the United States and a mentor to Donald Trump. That's just a piece of it. So the Cercle was also basically the Gladio operation in Italy was very much an operation of this Pinet Cercle. So now connecting back to Dugin. So as I mentioned, so Antoine Pinet, his friend was Raymond de Bellieu, whose student was Jean-Paul Valescu, who was a mentor to Alexander Dugin. Jean-Paul Valescu was also the member of this organization called GRECE, G-R-E-C-E. I can't remember what it's an acronym for. I can't remember what. It's basically sort of a sort of a scholarly society for the study of the Aryan race, or the something to that effect. What's interesting is that one of the members is Arthur Koestler. So he belonged to this group despite the fact that he was Jewish. And one of the things that Arthur Koestler popularized, so Arthur Koestler, this is what a lot of people don't realize. I don't know if people are familiar with him as an author, but he worked during World War II with Bill Donovan and Alan Dulles of the OAS and then subsequently the CIA. And he was deeply involved in, this is what Francis Saunders calls the cultural Cold War, which is basically when the CIA created the CCF, I can't remember what it's called.
It's the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
Thank you. And that was a core of an American CIA strategy to popularize, to advance American culture, to counter the influence of communism.
Well, look, I must say something about that because, you know, as a journalist myself and actually looking at the arts, it's amazing the influence these people had. Right. Really bringing out in the 1950s this Encounter magazine, which was incredibly influential in the arts right across the English-speaking world, particularly in Europe. And what they were doing is they were identifying US artists who had no political edge whatsoever to their art, and massively promoting them right across Europe, particularly. So they were saying, look at this amazing US art. People were being sort of impressed with it. They were putting exhibitions up in all capital cities, but they made sure that all of the should we say spiritual, political edge, you know, moral edge or whatever to the art was missing. Right.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating study. I highly recommend Stoner Saunders' book, because it's really crucial to understanding the conspiracies, you know, particularly the last half century. And like you said, they promoted tours of the Boston Pops. They promoted tours of Leontine Price because they wanted to show that, you know, the Soviets were successful at spreading the image of America as a racist country. So to try to counter that by, you know, touring Leontine Price, they basically created Jackson Pollock. So this is, you know, the great example of the Emperor's New Clothes. They managed to convince the world that his paint splatters were great art. Because when you look at what's interesting is the role, the ongoing role between MoMA, which is the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the CIA. And so they played a crucial role in this agenda as well, too. Anyway,
I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? With somebody like Jackson Pollock, really. I mean, he could have been anybody who had absolutely no artistic interest or ability whatsoever. Right. And you could stand him in front of a canvas and he would grab a piece of paint, a pot of paint, and just splash it on the canvas. And this was supposed to be great art. And in fact, many people around the world seem to agree with this and promote this kind of thing in art foundation courses, all sorts of things.
Yeah. I mean, I think no example really shows the fraud of modern art, not only the fraud of modern art, but also the astounding success that's possible, like the degree of deception that's possible, that you can convince a substantial portion of humanity that something as absurd as paint splatters is high art. It's really, 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 really amazing. Like if they can convince people of that, you can pretty much convince them on pretty much anything.
You can. Anyway, look, before we get too far away from Russia and Dugin, can you just say something about Rasputin? What's the significance? I mean, maybe you could say a little bit about him, you know, and why Dugin is referred to as Putin's Rasputin.
I don't think there's a direct connection. It's just more of the kind of similarity. So Rasputin, of course, was an advisor to the royal family. The Tsar Nicholas II and his wife. She believed that he was potentially able to cure her son or treat her son's hemophilia. Hemophilia is an interesting fact in that family because it's inherited from Queen Victoria. Right. This is how that entire family, they were very closely connected to the entire. This is why my chapter on synarchism deals very much with the royal bloodline of Queen Victoria and their intermarriage with the Romanovs. And the Romanovs themselves, too, is a very interesting family because it was founded by, I think his name was Mikhail Romanov, who, with the assistance apparently of John, the son of John Dee. And you find from that point forward, there's a deep connection between the Romanovs and the occult. Even people like Catherine the Great associated with people like the Comte Saint-Germain, and most importantly, Jacob Frank, as did her son, Paul. And so what happened is that Paul became, I think he was the founder, considered the founder of the Russian branch of the Knights of Malta, called the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, or something, SOSJ. And so this order, this is where really the story becomes really important, because that's the order that connects most of the fascist tradition for the most of the 21st century. One of the principal characters behind it was a guy named Boris Brasov. And he worked with another guy named Sidney Riley, who inspired the James Bond character. All these guys were basically double or triple agents working for both the British and the Russians.
Well, look, if you mention Sidney Riley, I just have to mention the Euston Films series from the 1980s, where Sam Neill does a brilliant job playing Sidney Riley. In Riley, Ace of Spies, which is one of the, it was written by Troy Kennedy Martin, who was one of the last great TV drama screenwriters. And Sam Neill plays it absolutely to a T. It's one of those things one of those old series, you can get it on DVD or whatever, or downloads, and you watch it and you think, what on earth is the rubbish they're serving us up on TV today? Because he really brings these issues of peace and war to light, and the way that Riley as one individual is playing one intelligence service off against another, and actually playing quite an important role in the run up to the First World War and during the First World War.
Yes, it's a very fascinating story, and all of them were working for Philip Wiseman, who was the head of British Intel. And he was linked to the Kuhn-Loeb Bank in that entire network. So that the Kuhn-Loeb Bank is basically what gave birth to American Zionism. And that's a network. So that's the Warburg family and Jacob Schiff. And so, of course, the Warburgs were the ones who primarily financed the rise of Hitler. And so the extensions go on and on and on. One main character was a guy named Otto Kahn, who was a friend of Aleister Crowley. And so that's where that whole story goes. I treat that in my book so people can look for details. But basically, Boris Brasov was one of the founders or members of an organization called the Aufbau. And the Aufbau was composed of White Russians who basically were opposed to the Bolsheviks. And so I think they settled, they're forced to settle outside of Russia. So they founded the Aufbau in Germany. And the Aufbau so there's a great book actually about this. It's called by, what's his name? Kellogg, something Russian. I can't remember the title. Fascinating book that shows the influence of the Aufbau and how it's the Aufbau that introduced the Protocols of Zion to the Nazis. Because the Protocols of Zion themselves are a very interesting book, because they emerged out of that same circle, that occultist circle around Papists that I had mentioned earlier. The person who was responsible for producing the protocols for Sergei Nihilist, who made the first translation, was a woman named Yuliana Glinka, who was a friend of Aleister Crowley. What's really interesting is that network also included a guy named William T. Still, who at the time was one of the most famous journalists in England. In 1890, he was one of the three original founders of the Cecil Rhodes Round Table. Again, another tangent. So Boris Brasov, after World War I, comes to the United States, and this is where he basically gives birth to the fascist movement in the United States. He becomes what's called the brain trust of an organization called the American First Committee, out of which you get the American Security Council, and those two organizations that basically give birth to the American right. And that's the organization which later becomes closely affiliated with the PNA Cercle. And this is how these groupings sort of work internationally. And as I mentioned, Roy Cohn was the principal character.
So let's move up a bit more closer to today on the post-war world. One of the fascinating in this section on the Black Order is you talk about the Order of the Nine Angles. Now, I mean, this is something that very few people seem to have come across and mentioned, but it seems extremely important. What they've done is they've basically set up a manifesto for action for individuals. Now, this is a satanic group. Let's make it absolutely clear. And this and the basic philosophy here is it's about self. It's about you are God. There is no God. You are God, and you can do what you want. Basically, this is the Crowley-esque kind of thing. But they also have various tenets by which they operate, and the idea is that you set up as a cell on your own and you just do these things and they will observe and recognize you, and there are various ways to progress through this order. So I mean, it sounds pretty satanic to me. It sounds like the sort of thing Crowley would rub his hands and love. But can you just say something about this order and how they operate, who they are?
Yeah, so they are probably the most important cult order today, in my humble estimation. But, to understand modern cultism, you really have to go back to the Illuminates of Thanateros, who were founded in the 1970s. Thanateros basically stands for Thanat, which means death, and Eros, which of course means, it's translated as love, but what it means is erotic love or lust. So it's basically a combination of death and sex, right? So necrophilia, or however you want to look at it. And they also worship the god Baphomet of the Templars, the satanic symbol, the Satan of the Templars. So it's really out of this network. So some very important people belong to it. You have William S. Burroughs, crucially important person in the modern history of the occult, and Timothy Leary, and Robert Anton Wilson, who is the popularizer of Discordianism. So out of this network is really where you get, most of the more recent occult groupings emerged. Not that the Order of Nine Angles came from, but the Order of Nine Angles was connected to that larger network. I can't get into all the names because I can't remember them all by heart, but basically they're mostly linked with the Church of Satan and Charles Manson. So this is where the Order of Nine Angles comes in. One guy who's really important, his name is James Mason. So he's a former member of the American Nazi Party, and he created a publication called Siege. And so he's also connected with all kinds of people with this modern occult scene, like Michael Moynihan, Boyd Rice, Adam Parfrey, and that whole network connected to the sort of like the black metal music scene and so on and so forth. So it typically connects back to the Process Church. And the Process Church is effectively where Charles Manson got his idea of a process, or his idea of a process. So this is where, this is why I say that all modern satanic orders share in common is this idea of accelerating the end times. And when we talk about the end times, we're talking about the Book of Revelation. So, where you see white, they see black. So what they where you see things as described as negative things, they see them as positive things. So where the Book of Revelation talks about the growing chaos that precedes the coming of the Messiah, they see it as their job to foment this chaos in order to accelerate the arrival of the Antichrist.
Okay, so let's just say something quickly here, because the idea for many Jews is this Messiah would be the Messiah of the Bible. Now, for many Christians, the Messiah would be the second coming of the Messiah. And maybe for these guys, this Messiah would be the Antichrist.
Well, yes, it is the Antichrist. I mean, they are Gnostics. They view the Bible, in particular the Book of Revelation, in the exact opposite way that you would, right? So for them, Satan is the hero, and so the advent of the Antichrist is the glorious advent of the New World Order.
Okay, can you just get our heads around that? How can Satan be the hero?
Well, I mean, how can Satan rebel against God? How can you how
Well,
can you be how can you be in the position that he was? See that God is the creator, all powerful, uh, and he knows that he is condemned to hellfire for eternity as long as he doesn't, change his agenda. But he still chooses otherwise. This
yeah.
is not something, this is an aspect of human psychology which unfortunately has not been studied, and I'm sure won't be studied. But I think one of our the greatest, most intriguing capacity of the human mind is its ability to deceive itself.
Yeah, I
Uh,
agree.
so when it comes to ego or pride, as has been referred to, and arrogance, it's a very, very difficult thing to explain, and I
Well,
can't.
we almost seem to be living in an age where this is becoming amongst our leaders the norm, where
Absolutely.
they will say things which clearly don't actually hang together and make any sense. So, people are sitting there scratching their heads. In fact, many people completely tune out of the daily news round because they see the whole thing as absurd and actually quite disturbing.
Absolutely. So we have to understand that I refer to the post. Well, I refer to the era that we're living in as a post Enlightenment, or more precisely post God. So I see ourselves as living in a single era that began with the French and American revolutions, and it's effectively an atheistic era, and that allows the proliferation of nonsense as it has been happening, because it's basically completely unbound, or has no fixed grounding for it to remain rational. So where were we?
Well, okay. So, with the order with
So
the
the
order of
important point is,
Nyack. Sorry, did you want to carry on? Sorry.
yeah. So the important point is Satanism. We have to, the Enlightenment was the first. If the Rosicrucians were the first movement that sort of felt that they were able to have the audacity to announce themselves to the world, they didn't announce themselves as Satanists, but they were Satanists. It was really not until the French Revolution of 1789 that these Satanists achieved political power. These are groups and societies and individuals who had remained on the margins for centuries, who had constantly been battling with the power of the church, being burned at the stake, being marginalized, being denounced as heretics. For centuries, they were unable to get any kind of foothold of power, and it's really with 1789, with much of the 17th century, where they managed to organize themselves through the Illuminati, through Freemasonry, to infiltrate power and to orchestrate a revolution, that they basically achieved their first foothold. And that's what we're seeing, an expansion of that foothold ever since. So it's important to remember too that one of the most important legends among these occultists is the legend of Faust. Right? First popularized by Christopher Marlowe in England, and then most importantly by Goethe, who was a member of the Illuminati. And effectively, if I remember correctly, it's been a long time since I read it, but the character of Faust is to some extent a sympathetic character, because he sells his soul to the devil because of his quest for knowledge. So in the end, ultimately, he's sort of forgiven. So this is how you have to understand that this is a consciously Luciferian agenda. These are people who do regard Satan as, maybe, if not necessarily a being, but at least a symbol of rebellion against conventional morality. And so, this is how fascism is born out of it, because fascism is exactly that. Fascism is a political system founded on the leadership of an elite who recognize that there are no rules, and that they are superior to the masses because of that very, in their minds, because of that very fact. And that effectively,
I think for centuries, it seems that the elites, certainly in Europe, have always made sure that they come across anyway superficially as Christian. It's just that more and more today, I mean, that is getting completely discarded. In fact, we are now going to have the coronation of King Charles here in May in the UK. Charles has openly stated his skepticism about the Christian God and the Bible, and he talks about that he wants to be the defender of the faiths rather than the defender of the faith, and yet he's going to go through a ceremony which puts him in as the head of the Church of England. So, I mean, maybe what's going on here is the Church of England is really being turned into a kind of multi-faith church, which isn't Christian at all. But what do you reckon? What do you make of King Charles and the way he fits into all this? He's in this kind of no man's land at the moment, where he's king, but he's not actually had his coronation. And it's been amazing. The last few weeks, we've seen lists of musicians pulling out of his coronation concert, and there seems to be this kind of feeling, even within the establishment, that maybe Charles isn't the right man for the job. And anyway, so what do you make of the way he fits into all of this? Because obviously, for the British, he's going to be the man in charge. We've seen just with the organisation, the political discussions around the role of Northern Ireland and the relationship with the European Union over the last few weeks. He's been very much involved with that, something that his mother would have just left to the officials to get on with it. And he's been, hands-on.
Well, so it's interesting that you should ask. So, the thing is, it's so hard to talk about Dugin concisely because, he is a pinpoint of such a wide range of influences that really I've covered in at least 3 volumes of my book, right? So, Prince Charles is a traditionalist with a capital T.
Sorry,
yes.
King Charles.
King Charles, thank you. Yes, right. I'll have to get out of that habit. So King Charles is a traditionalist with a capital T. This is a tradition that dates back to, really goes back to René Guénon. So this is another person I forgot to mention who was one of the key people in a pantheon of occultists in the last century and a half. So Guénon basically espoused this idea that of the primordial tradition, another idea that was very much of interest to Huxley and a lot of the occult, of course. The idea is that all of the religions that are practiced in the world have an exoteric husk. So the version that is practiced by the unknowing public, but each of these religions has a esoteric core, and that core is the same. And so the primordial tradition is considered, the core of what they called ancient wisdom. The ancient wisdom is an idea that goes back to the Renaissance, and Marsilio Ficino that's a whole other tangent as well too. But the ancient wisdom is actually the Kabbalah, or even Hermeticism, and Hermeticism in turn is derived from Kabbalah. So the reality is that most of the leading world's religions have been influenced by the Kabbalah. There are aspects of it. So Christianity, there's Gnosticism, and the sort of like the Cathar heresies, the Templar heresies, Rosicrucianism, and so on and so forth. In Judaism, there's Kabbalah. In Hinduism and Buddhism, you have Tantra. In Islam, you have Sufism. And so these traditionalists, they treat Sufism as being a legitimate product of these religions, when in fact they are heresies, or Sufism is effectively in many ways a heresy of Islam. So because René Guénon, what he did is that, towards the end of his career, he chose Islam as his exoteric religion. And so that's kind of a bit that sort of influenced a lot of his followers, and a lot of them became interested in the study of religion. There's one guy in particular, his name is Fritjof Schoen. I'm really bastardizing his name. Sorry, Schoen. He's a Swiss occultist, and he founded an order called the Mariamia that Dugin belongs to. And this is a pseudo-Sufi cult that practices sex rites, and there's a numerous, very well-known historians and scholars who have belonged to it, like Titus Burckhardt, like Martin Lings, another famous traditionalist is Syed Hossein Nasr, very well known. He's at the same time a friend of Henry Kissinger, as well as Peter Lamborn Wilson, aka Hakim Bey, who is friends with Robert Anton Wilson and Kerry Thornley, the founders of Discordianism. So you can see how this network is all very, very well connected. So out of this Mariamia is basically where you get this network of sort of these pseudo-Islamic, traditionalists, and that's where that again Dugin is a member of, and that's where King Charles gets his. This is why there's been many fears that have been, sort of circulated about King Charles being secretly a Muslim, when the reality is that he's a pseudo-Sufi traditionalist.
Oh, okay, interesting. But look, we're talking about the Order of the Nine Angles, and we're kind of skirted around quite a major issue to do with them, which is human sacrifice, David.
Yes, exactly. So the Order of Nine Angles openly advocate human sacrifice. What they also advocate is infiltrating all kinds of groups. And so this is what been doing recently. They've been infiltrating a number of fascist groups, neo-fascist terrorist groups. One of them is the Otto Waffen group, which is new. So there's a growing network of international neo-fascist groups. And so this is how one of them is connected with is the Azov battalion that played a key role in the so-called resistance happening in Ukraine. So this is a network now they sort of converge on a forum called the Iron March Forum that was founded recently, I think 2015 or something like that. And Iron March was founded by a follower of Alexander Dugin. So this is where you get the contradiction of Dugin, openly denouncing the Nazi influence in Ukraine, which is very true. But what he is not telling you is that he comes himself from a background of Nazi sympathy with numerous affiliations with Nazi heritage, particularly the Polaire heritage, which he openly advocates, and his influence in this growing network of neo-Nazi terrorist groups. Dugin was also affiliated with a guy named Kerry Bolton, and Kerry Bolton is the official distributor of the Order of Nine Angles. So again, this is how they're all connected. So to get back to your friend Nick Land, all these groups advocate political doctrine known as accelerationism, and that again is the idea that they need to accelerate the coming of the end times, and they do so by carrying out acts of terrorism. And
this is a human sacrifice for them. It's like a badge of honor.
Yes, they're Satanists, right? It's hard to wrap your mind around it, but it's hard to understand. If you can put yourself in the mind of Satanists, where killing a child is a positive work, right? Murdering an innocent person is a positive.
How do they justify that to themselves?
I do not know. But that's going back to the same old mystery. There's not one I can explain.
I mean, I think it may have something sort of to do with this whole idea of the blood being sacred, and this whole idea of sacrifice being sacred. But it's the ultimate sacrifice, a human sacrifice. This is also linked. If you go, right back to the Carthaginians. I mean, this is the sort of thing that they were doing.
Well, that's the thing. To understand Satanism, we have to understand that Satanism is a kind of evil, right? Evil exists before Satan, right? Evil is basically a rejection of good, right? So evil is nihilism. Nihilism basically, so the idea that there is no governing good behind the creation of the universe. Everything is just chaotic. So this is why nihilism has been a very important influence, or I guess manifestation of this belief system. You can only understand Satanism if you understand nihilism. And nihilism, so basically, is the idea that if there is no God, then there is no truth, right? The universe is just black. There is zero consequence for your actions. Nothing matters. So you could kill a child, it doesn't matter. There are no consequences. And this is where
it's almost like they're saying that the fact that, most people think there are is just the big lie, and they've seen through it.
Exactly. So this is how they view their own superiority, right? They view themselves in a Nietzschean sense that they are Übermensch because they are able to what Nietzsche called achieve positive nihilism, right? So this is why so even though we're living in this post-God era, 98% of people who have been sucked into it have not come to terms with what it means. And if there's no God, there is no truth. And so most people have rationalized that, that's why we have now ethics instead of, the Bible and morals. But they haven't come to terms with the fact that, no, you cannot justify morality without the existence of a supreme being. But so they see themselves as having the courage to do that. And so this is why, and this is nothing new. And you find this same thinking, nihilist thinking, going all the way back to the Gnostics, and of course going back to the worship of Moloch in ancient times, right? This is a propensity. This is the ultimate question that every human being, regardless of the existence, regardless of their knowledge of the Bible or Satan, it's a fundamental question that every human being is poised to ask himself: is what am I here for? Is there a purpose to my existence or not? And if some choose to not recognize the evident existence of some kind of good creator, they will choose, typically out of arrogance, that everything is here by accident. And if they do, they choose to believe that there is no such thing as morality. So what's important now is to recognize that not only is there no morality, but like Nietzsche said, all that's left is the triumph of the will, right? All that's left is the advancement of your own good. And that can be at the expense of the others, especially if they are weak, quote unquote, if they're unable to recognize this positive nihilism. So if you go back to the Gnostics, they also believe that God was a bad God, right? God imposed all these rules that suppressed our natural instincts, as they like to refer to them, right? So he suppressed incense, he suppressed adultery, he suppressed thievery, he suppressed murder. He basically prevented you from doing anything you want. And in their mind, you should be able to do everything you want. So in a way for them to actualize this nihilistic belief system, they believe they have to overturn and sometimes do evil just for the sake of evil, just as a way of proving their disbelief. This is why you look at the early Gnostic rituals, and they have to do with eating feces and swallowing urine and menstrual fluid, murder and adultery and all these things as open acts of defiance, as a ways of sort of demonstrating and proving their doing the defiance.
Yeah, the fact that we've got these people, I mean, certainly, this things seem to be going their way. It's rather concerning that that part of their philosophy, this nihilist philosophy, but I mean, it's actually becoming kind of more organised and getting a bit of force multiplication, which is a bit concerning. That they like the idea that through the media, through government, through other forms of influence, maybe even through universities and things like that, that if they can actually get people to be to actually destroy themselves, to be the instruments of their own demise, and that for them is a triumph. If people are doing things which are actually destructive to themselves, and the part of the culture becomes self-destructive. I mean, that sounds quite concerning. If these sorts of people are, and you were saying earlier on that one of their objects is to basically to infiltrate positions of power too.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, this is why my book is called Ordo ab Chaos, which order out of chaos. Right? They believe that they need to sow chaos to bring about.
It just sounds like all chaos and no order.
Yeah, but you gotta put your they're Satanists, right? They don't believe in order. They believe in the absence of order. They believe only in the triumph of the will, in survival of the fittest. They're not looking for a world order where they're going to enforce, order and then everything's going to be hunky dory. They're looking for an order that they will establish and remove morality.
Yeah, it's a pretty scary prospect. But you talked about you mentioned my friend Nick Land. He really wasn't my friend. I mean, I thought it's one of those things that you read in these Victor Ostrovsky books, the Mossad exposés. I thought he was my friend, where somebody has kind of, been friendly to you. And then you realise, as I did, back at, when I was 16 years of age or so, coming back to school after the holidays, someone I'd been friends with for nearly 3 years, didn't want to know me. He changed his philosophy. He was now a communist. He had different friends. He had different interests, which is actually totally acceptable because we moved into the sixth form and there were plenty of girls around. That was suddenly, after a boys' school, suddenly if you got girls, then maybe, you might drop a few of your boyfriends. But I mean, what about him? And does he actually endorse this Order of the Nine Angles? Because I know in a previous interview you were hinting that he did.
Yes, he did. So this is, it's important I recognize that Nick Land is considered the father of accelerationism. And this is how it all connects. So what's interesting is that I mentioned that the Process Church is really the organization that is behind all of this, right? And you got to understand how the Process Church connects everything, right? So Process Church links to the Manson killings, right? Because he was trying to accelerate the end times as well. And
just sorry, but I don't want to interrupt you, David, but really, Manson seemed to be trying to start a race war. That's one of the, purposes of what he was up to, basically killing whites, pretending to be blacks and vice versa.
Yes, to create chaos, right? It's not a race war itself, but to create a race war to create chaos, right? So to look at this network now, the Manson killings involved the wife of Roman Polanski, right? Who filmed Rosemary's Baby, whose advisor was Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, right? The producer of Rosemary's Baby was Robert Evans, and Robert Evans was friends with what is his name? This is what Maury Terry revealed, who was the recognized head of the Process Church. And interesting, Robert Evans is a very influential person in Hollywood. He basically produced, I think, Chinatown, the Cotton Club. I can't remember what else. He was married for I think a week to Catherine Oxenberg. She was the daughter. Anyway, too many tangents here. Catherine Oxenberg's daughter ended up being an NXIVM. And Robert Evans was also friends with Henry Kissinger. Right. So again, that name pops up. So it's a side network basically that connects the Church of Satan. And so this is how you get back to people like James Mason, who was the founder of the Siege magazine, which is also influential in this Iron March forums. So what happened is that when the Process Church, in fact, there's a whole chapter I have to, I'm just going to mention briefly where the Process Church comes from. Process Church was founded by two people. One of them was Marianne de Grimstone, and she was a former wife of Sugar Ray Robinson, the boxer, but she was one of the girls that were working for Stephen Ward. And Stephen Ward is the one that used to operate a Masonic black magic sex parties at Cliveden House. And the Cliveden House is the location of the what's so-called Cliveden set. And the Cliveden set is just another name for the Round Table. It was the house that belonged to Lady Astor and her whole circle. And that's basically basically regrouped the network of collaborationists, British collaborationists during World War II. So Stephen Ward was also friends with William Hitchcock, who funded Timothy Leary's Millbrook experiments on Millbrook Estate.
Well, this was Christine Keeler and the Profumo affair, of course, involved in all this.
Most importantly, Christine Keeler of the Profumo affair. Right? So just to tell you how deep this goes. So the Process Church is not just this one fringe little cult that, showed up in California and influenced Charles Manson. It's really at the core. When the Process Church disbanded, a lot of its members then went and started to hang around Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze, who's one of the leading figures in the postmodernist movement, connected with people like Derrida and Foucault and that whole network. Again, this is another network now, which is, I talk about them in my chapter called Make Love, Not War. I can't give you all the connections, but there's a lot of deep sort of subversive connections that they're involved in. And so this is to show you the broader connection of the Process Church. And so Land picked up on this idea of, this sort of postmodernist challenge to the capitalist system that he inherited from Deleuze, and that's what effectively influenced the modern accelerationist movement. And that accelerationist movement is, so not only is Nick Land has endorsed the Order of the Nine Angles, but the Order of the Nine Angles now is affiliated with this network of neo-fascist, neo-Nazi terrorist organizations who have adopted the accelerationist philosophy, which they interpret as carrying out acts of terror to foment chaos, to accelerate the coming of the end times.
Yeah, well, I wonder how many of our police special branches around the British police forces have got any knowledge of this at all, because, when these events happen, these terrorist attacks, we've just had the results of the Manchester Arena inquiry, where was 22, I believe, people were killed at the Manchester Arena in the run-up to the 2017 general election, with Jeremy Corbyn was standing. And, of course, the entire agenda during that election campaign got steered towards these three terror attacks, got steered towards terrorism. And, in fact, the so-called culprit, Salman Abedi, was very well known to the intelligence services. His father was an MI6 agent. And actually now one of the it's the first time this has happened so far. But what do you make of this? Because you've also done a whole book about terrorism too, haven't you?
Yeah, so it's par for the course, I think, for terrorists to be working for the secret services somehow. I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, to circle back to our original topic, it's interesting to see how Dugin is coming out and denouncing the Nazis in Ukraine when really he's the main figure behind this growing network of neo-Nazi terrorists, part of which have manifested in Ukraine. So he's indirectly affiliated or responsible for the rise of some of the neo-Nazi groups that he's denouncing. And so I think, it's hard for me. It's really hard to understand what influence these occultists have in the political arena. To what extent are they trying to influence things from the sidelines, or to what extent do they actually shape policies and developments? So this is what's so interesting about a guy like Dugin, is that he's just so fringe. So in his case, it's really hard to tell what direct influence he has, even though you can tell that ideologically he has a very large influence. So, for his ties with Russian intelligence, I would certainly suspect that he has ties with American intelligence too, in some way. This is a suspicion. Nobody is to quote me on that, but that's what I suspect. It would be par for the course. all the leading Russian occultists of the 20th century have been double agents, starting with Blavatsky. So it'd be nothing new. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting how things have evolved from. Terrorism really is a fabricated phantom that has, been deployed to serve the purposes of this New World Order agenda, for lack of a better word. It's interesting that that's a concept that was treated in Orwell's 1984, where this Emmanuel Goldstein is the leader of this terrorist underground. And basically what you're supposed to get out of the book is that you don't know whether he's real or not. And so it's interesting how, first things evolved to exploit so-called Islamic terrorism, and now there's this rise of neo-Nazi terrorism. It's not quite the scare that's being manufactured as it was for Islamic terrorism, but it'll be curious. It's definitely had a substantial influence recently, and it'd be interesting to see how, where they're going to take it.
Yeah, I mean, all these sort of gurus, including Nick Land himself, they really do believe in having their kind of books and manifestos and that sort of thing. Yeah. Nick's is this thing called the Dark Enlightenment, which right. is, this seems almost to link back to the original Enlightenment, in that it's saying, well, that was where we kind of came out into the open. We were doing things which, made us acceptable to society. Now we're in control. This is the real Enlightenment, which is our ordo ab chaos in some way. So what do you make of his Dark Enlightenment?
I don't know, but what's interesting is that the Dark Enlightenment influenced the neo-reaction movement started by Curtis Yarvin, another Silicon Valley dude, and that influenced in turn Peter Thiel. And so Peter Thiel is a very important person. He's also a participant of the Bilderberg meetings, extensive links with the CIA through his founding of Palantir, which basically services as a government contractor, CIA contractor. It was also Palantir that was responsible for helping Cambridge Analytica breach the Facebook data that they constructed their profiles with. And Cambridge Analytica, of course, then was founded by Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, both of whom belong to the Council for National Policy, which is a direct outgrowth of the right-wing movement that I was explaining earlier, that grew out of the American First Committee and the American Security Council under the influence of Boris Brassall. So very interesting to see how this international fascism always seems to be connected, and how, by what coincidence is my chapter on techno-libertarianism, so the rise of libertarian, neoliberal politics in Silicon Valley ends with Peter Thiel, and then his connection to Dark Enlightenment back to Nick Land and its connection to accelerationism and Alexander Dugin.
Palantir, they had an article in the Times newspaper which got rather quickly pulled down, where he's talking about, I think it's called Meta Constellation, which is one of the Palantir bits of software, boasting that this is Alex Karp's company, funded by Peter Thiel, and very much a sort of Bilderberg creation, really. The people that have been going to those meetings, dreaming up this idea, getting their buddies who own banks to just finance it. Now, that article explains that the AI that Palantir has created in Meta Constellation is playing the key role, apparently, for the targeting by the Ukrainian army. So what they're doing is they're linking up the Ukrainian spotters with US satellites and just letting the AI do the targeting.
Yes. Yeah, and with some assistance from Elon Musk's Starlink as well, too, of course.
Yep. It's just a Bilderberg. Look, listen, fascinating stuff. But can we just finish on a note which is a little bit more sort of, shall we say, sober and again a stand back from all this, because you've described all these various different, I would just simply call them fake versions of the different faiths. The idea that there is this version that's rolled out to the public, but deep down at the back of it. And I think many of us understand that this is how the Roman Church started when Constantine. That actually there is a fundamental difference between these Eastern and Western religions. The sort of thing I suppose the Beatles were trying to reverse. The actual philosophy behind them is very different. You've got this kind of Zoroastrian, Jewish, Islamic, Christian tradition, which is dualistic. So you've got basically light versus dark, good versus evil. Whereas the Eastern Church seems to be very different. Churches seem to be very different. Hindus, etc., where they're looking at kind of good and evil need to balance out. So can you just say something about that?
I don't know if I would, because I don't think that's the problem is that there's a difference between sort of the legitimate Hindu and Buddhist tradition that is practiced by many people in that part of the world, and the sort of bastardized version that was adopted and popularized by
that's very. It's the same. Right. It's the same in the West with the Christian tradition, isn't it? So I'm just wondering about the actually the core beliefs here, the real beliefs that have been obscured by these people.
Well, I mean, really, it goes back to the Masonic idea of Oriental Kabbalah, right? So you have the two people who are responsible for that were William Ramsay, or Chevalier William Ramsay, one of the founders of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and Swedenborg. So Swedenborg was affiliated with the Moravian Church, which was basically a crypto-Sabbatian organization. And they practiced various sort of, sex magical rites influenced by the Kabbalah. So this is all covered by Martha Key Schuchard. She's read several just astoundingly interesting books. And so when these this is at the time when the British East India Company was active, so there was a lot of discovery of Indian culture. And so when they discovered the tradition of Tantra, the sexual tradition of Tantra, they believed that they had discovered what they called an Oriental Kabbalah that was similar to their Kabbalah. And so what they ended up proposing was that the Tantra in India was a Kabbalah which was actually older than the Jewish Kabbalah. And this is how you get the theory of the Aryan race, because then it was proposed that it was the Aryans who had been responsible before the Jews of introducing this Kabbalah to the Orient. And so I've got a whole chapter in my book, the first volume, on Gog and Magog, which talks about, the extensive influence of, because what people forget about that part of the world is that Tibet, maybe not Tibet, but at least places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and northern India were part of a Greek kingdom, right? So when Alexander conquered that part of the world, for centuries it remained under Greek authority. And you have this whole centuries of what they call Greco-Indo-Greek civilization, I guess. I can't remember the word exactly, but there's this long cross influence between Greek and Hindu and Eastern culture. This is where I believe that the caste system came from, because the caste system is identical to Plato's hierarchy of priests. I can't remember what the middle group is, and the lower classes, the untouchables. So basically, at this time, you've got this. It's also very important that at the turn of the millennium, when occultism was really starting to spread, particularly in the city of Alexandria, there was a number of influences that were important there. So you had the Egyptian Hermeticists, you had the Greek philosophers, you had the Zoroastrian or Persian Magi, you had the Jewish Kabbalah, and another important influence that rarely gets remembered is what are called the Gymnosophists. And the Gymnosophists were Magi from India. So Indian occultism was already influencing Western occultism at the turn of the first millennium. And you find that even from that time, there was already like a cross influence. So there's the Gospel of Thomas, which is famous as well too, because St. Thomas apparently traveled and proselytized in India, and the Manichaeans in particular. So apparently, for a period of time, Tibet was almost fully Manichaean. A Manichaean was basically an occult cult. So that already from very early on, you've got this penetration of likely Western Gnostic influences into India, which would have contributed to the Tantra. And then those were treated later by modern occultists as being original traditions, which of course they were not. So it's very important when we talk about, the influence of the East or the Eastern tradition, that we differentiate it, because really the way it's been popularized today was largely through the influence of people in the tradition of Blavatsky, and what they are referring to is Tibetan Buddhism in particular, which is a very highly modified, very heretical branch version of Tibetan Buddhism, which was adopted heavily from Tantra and most importantly Bon shamanism. So it's very remote from the true, more I would say legitimate and I don't know what's the right word, but respectable tradition of Buddhism. I guess it's a very much, deviated form of Buddhism.
Yeah, well, look, the media is not really looking at this. And if it is, it's confusing us. It's actually, I think, a great kind of wave of demoralization sweeping across particularly the Western world at the moment because of the appalling state of our mass media. So Dennis Wheatley, he was an author I've got a lot of time for, I think just a brilliant writer. He was also a deception planner in World War II, and he wrote several occult novels. In fact, he took Aleister Crowley and others out to supper in the evening, dinner with them in order to get information to write his novels. He was quite scrupulous about making sure that they were quite close to reality. But he said in the 1970s or 1960s, when he was recorded by the BBC, he said he was very concerned that the forces of darkness were going to come out on top, and that's the way it was looking, and things are getting worse and worse every day. He said that we've really got to draw a line basically and stop this. What do you say to those that are looking at this unfolding in the press, feeling rather depressed, and listening to Wheatley in the background saying everything's getting worse every day?
Yeah, it's true, and it's getting pretty worrisome. But this is a test for humanity. This is a test for each of us individually. No matter how much power they can accumulate. If they had all the nuclear weapons and, all the technology, all the AI technology, all the money in the world, even if they had everything at their disposal, that power would still be dwarfed by God's power. So we should never, ever despair, right? We should always remember that there's nothing they can do to achieve so much power that they will be insurmountable. What our job is to ask, and that's all God is waiting on us to do. I mean, God helps those who help themselves, right? So it's not going to be an easy task because we're going to be tested in our commitment to the fight. But our goal, our responsibility is to combat it and to always remain hopeful that in the end, good will triumph. It's inevitable.
Well, it's fascinating to see with the coronation coming up, the links between King Charles and the World Economic Forum, the COP summits, this whole zero carbon agenda. He's absolutely nailed his colours to that mast. And there is this letter going around in the UK at the moment, really demanding that Charles relinquish these links, these political ties to these before becoming king, and because otherwise he will be breaking his coronation oath, and he cannot do that. So this, which has been being sent to the Duke of Norfolk, who's in charge of the coronation. So there's that kind of going on in the background. And I wonder whether actually there is a bit of pushback with all these artists pulling out of his coronation party. A lot of people are very suspicious about the death of his wife, believing that it was all very convenient, because she was taking up with a Muslim, and of course that would have meant that William had a Muslim, half brothers maybe or whatever. And so I think there is definitely, there is part of the establishment which recognises the dangers that these occultists may be dragging us down. But anyway, look, sorry, David, I think you're right. It is about keeping the faith, keeping the simple childlike understanding of the difference between right and wrong, of good and bad. Yeah. And so whereabouts can people find your Ordo Ab Chao, and can we actually get printed copies of it?
Yes, you can. So I've got a website, which is ordoabchao.ca. And so all 6 volumes are online to be read for free. If you go to there's a link on the homepage, or if you go to the About page, there's links to all my previous books, as well as links to buy this book, all the 6 volumes, on Amazon. It's available on print and Kindle at Amazon.
David Livingstone, thanks very much for joining us again.
Thanks, Tony.